Russia is the largest country on Earth. It covers 11 time zones, spans 2 continents, borders 14 different countries, and contains enough nuclear weapons to destroy the planet several times over. No nation in human history has ever controlled this much continuous land. But here is what is truly strange. In September 1983, one single Russian officer named Stanislav Petrov sat alone in a secret bunker outside Moscow. Suddenly, early warning alarms began blaring. The computer screen reported that 5 American nuclear missiles were flying straight toward Russia. Protocol dictated that Petrov instantly press the button to launch a retaliatory nuclear strike that would have wiped out human civilization. Petrov looked at the screen, trusted his gut, decided it was a computer glitch, and did nothing. He was right. It was a glitch. One guy sitting in a chair saved every human being alive today. That is the kind of history Russia has. High stakes, extreme paranoia, and absolute chaos. For 1,500 years, the Mongols destroyed it, Napoleon destroyed it, and Hitler destroyed it. All 3 of them lost, and every single time, Russia came back bigger, colder, and scarier than before. So how did a bunch of isolated, mud-splattered wooden villages in a freezing swamp become an unstoppable, nuclear-armed land empire? To understand Russia, you have to go all the way back 1,500 years to a place where people were so bad at running their own lives that they literally called foreign invaders to come and conquer them. We start in the year 860 AD. Back then, there was no Russia, no Moscow, and no St. Petersburg. The endless forests and swamps of Eastern Europe were inhabited by scattered Slavic tribes. They lived in small wooden huts, hunted bears, and had one massive problem. They could not stop fighting each other. Every village was at war with the next village. The bloodshed got so bad and so exhausting that according to ancient chronicles, the tribal leaders finally held a meeting and did something completely bizarre. They sent a letter to the Vikings across the Baltic Sea. The letter literally read, "Our land is vast and rich, but there is no order in it. Come and rule over us." Imagine being so utterly terrible at self-governance that you call the Vikings for help. A Viking chieftain named Rurik took up the offer. He gathered his warriors, sailed down the rivers of Eastern Europe, looked at the cold, swampy landscape, and said, "Yeah, all right." Rurik and his brothers established a ruling dynasty that built a powerful medieval state centered around the city of Kiev. They called this state Kievan Rus. Look at this map, stretching from the Baltic Sea all the way down to the Black Sea. Kievan Rus grew fast, trading furs, wax, and slaves with the wealthy Byzantine Empire to the south. By the year 988 AD, Rurik's great-grandson, Prince Vladimir the Great, decided that Kievan Rus needed an official state religion to unite his people. So, Vladimir sent ambassadors across the world to inspect the major religions. He rejected Islam because it banned alcohol. Vladimir famously declared, "Drinking is the joy of the Rus. We cannot exist without it." You can't make this stuff up. He rejected Judaism because he thought losing Jerusalem meant their God was not strong enough. Then his ambassadors visited the Hagia Sophia Cathedral in Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. They returned to Vladimir weeping, claiming they did not know whether they were in heaven or on earth. Vladimir was sold. He converted to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, ordered his entire population to march into the Dnieper River to be baptized, and snapped his country's cultural ties to Europe, linking Russia directly to the Byzantine world instead. For a couple of centuries, Kievan Rus was wealthy, cultured, and powerful. Then came the year 1237, and everything was smashed to pieces. Out of the Asian steppes rode a force of nature that no one in Europe was prepared for: the Mongols. Led by Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, a massive army of horse archers swept across the frozen rivers of Rus in midwinter. They moved faster than any army in history. One by one, ancient Russian cities refused to surrender, and one by one, the Mongols burned them to the ground. In 1240, the Mongols arrived at Kiev. They destroyed the magnificent city so completely that European travelers passing through years later reported that almost nothing was left except piles of skulls on the plain. The Mongols did not want to live in the freezing Russian forests. They just wanted cash. They established a system known as the Mongol Yoke, forcing all the surviving Russian princes to travel to the Golden Horde's capital, bow low in the dirt, and beg for a special wooden token called a yarlik, which granted them permission to rule their own lands and collect taxes for the Khan. If a prince fell behind on his tax payments, the Mongol cavalry would ride in and burn his entire town. And this is where a tiny, insignificant wooden outpost, sitting in the middle of a dense forest, enters the story: Moscow. In the early 1300s, Moscow was nothing. It was not even on most maps. But its prince, a clever and ruthless man named Ivan I, figured out how to game the Mongol system. Ivan offered to become the chief tax collector for the Golden Horde. He went around to all the other Russian cities, extracted heavy taxes from them, handed most of it to the Mongols, and quietly kept a huge cut for himself. His nickname was literally Ivan Moneybag. Moscow used that stolen wealth to build stone walls, buy up neighboring land, and bribe the Mongol Khans. While other Russian cities were getting destroyed for rebelling, Moscow stayed safe, grew rich, and quietly became the political center of the entire region. By 1380, Moscow was strong enough to do the unthinkable. Prince Dmitry of Moscow marched an army out to Kulikovo Field and actually defeated a Mongol army in battle. Exactly 100 years later, in 1480, Grand Prince Ivan III marched his army to the Ugra River, faced down the Golden Horde, and refused to pay another cent of tribute. The Mongols, fractured by internal civil wars, simply turned around and rode away. After 250 years of brutal oppression, Russia was finally free. But the Mongol yoke had fundamentally rewired the Russian mindset. Russian rulers learned that to survive in a flat, defenseless land surrounded by enemies, you needed absolute power, concentrated in a single man, a massive army, and zero tolerance for internal dissent. And nobody demonstrated that brutal new mindset better than Ivan III's grandson, Ivan IV. You probably know him by his far more famous title, Ivan the Terrible. In 1547, 16-year-old Ivan crowned himself with a brand new title, Tsar, derived from the Latin word Caesar. He was no longer just a grand prince. He was an emperor appointed directly by God. At first, Ivan was actually a brilliant ruler. He conquered the Mongol strongholds of Kazan and Astrakhan, expanded Russia's borders all the way to the Ural Mountains, built St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, and printed the first books in Russian history. Then, his beloved wife Anastasia died suddenly, and Ivan went completely, utterly insane. He became convinced that his noble lords, the boyars, had poisoned his wife. Ivan abandoned Moscow, created his own personal secret police force called the Oprichniki, and dressed them in black robes. They rode black horses carrying severed dogs' heads tied to their saddles, symbolizing their job, to bite the Tsar's enemies and sweep them away. For 7 horror-filled years, Ivan waged war against his own population. He tortured thousands of nobles, wiped out whole families, and destroyed the entire city of Novgorod because he suspected them of treason, throwing thousands of tied-up citizens into a frozen river. The ultimate tragedy occurred in 1581. During a furious argument in the palace, Ivan struck his eldest son and heir, Prince Ivan, on the head with his heavy iron-tipped staff. The prince died a few days later. Ivan was left weeping over his son's corpse, realizing he had just killed the future of his own dynasty. When Ivan the Terrible died in 1584, he left behind a traumatized, exhausted country ruled by his remaining son, Fyodor, who was mentally unfit to govern and died without leaving an heir. The 300-year-old Rurik dynasty was dead. and Russia instantly plunged into a dark, chaotic era historians call the Time of Troubles. Imagine 15 years of total anarchy. Famine killed a third of the population. Impostors claimed to be Ivan the Terrible's dead son. Swedish armies invaded from the north, and Polish troops actually marched into Moscow and captured the Kremlin. Russia was on the verge of disappearing from the map completely. Sensing total extinction, ordinary Russian citizens took matters into their own hands. A butcher named Kuzma Minin and a prince named Dmitry Pozharsky raised a volunteer peasant army, marched to Moscow, fought their way into the city, and kicked the Polish army out of the Kremlin. In 1613, representatives from all over Russia met in Moscow to choose a new Tsar. They picked a 16-year-old nobleman named Michael Romanov. The Romanov dynasty was born, and it would rule Russia for the next 304 years. For the first 100 years under the Romanovs, Russia remained an isolated medieval land. Nobles wore long traditional robes, men grew massive beards, and the country had almost zero navy, zero modern universities, and zero influence in European politics. Then came a giant of a man, literally 6 feet 8 inches tall, who dragged Russia kicking and screaming into the modern world, Peter the Great. Peter became Tsar in 1682, and he was obsessed with everything Western. In 1697, he did something no Russian ruler had ever done. He put on a disguise, traveled to Western Europe incognito, and worked as an ordinary ship carpenter in the Netherlands and England to learn how to build a modern navy. When Peter returned to Moscow, he brought back European engineers, scientists, military officers, and a burning desire to change everything. The very next morning after his return, Peter summoned his top nobles to the palace, pulled out a massive pair of shears, and personally started cutting off their traditional long beards. He passed a law banning long beards and traditional robes. If a nobleman wanted to keep his beard, he had to pay a special beard tax and wear a copper token around his neck that said, "The beard is a useless burden." Peter completely overhauled the army, built Russia's first real navy, and went to war with the superpower of Northern Europe, Sweden. In 1703, right in the middle of that brutal 20-year war, Peter looked at a desolate, frozen, disease-ridden swamp on the Baltic coast and decided to build a brand new capital city from scratch. He called it St. Petersburg. Tens of thousands of serfs and Swedish prisoners of war died of malaria, exhaustion, and cold while draining the swamps and laying foundations. St. Petersburg was literally built on human bones, but it gave Russia its long-sought window to Europe. By the time Peter died in 1725, Russia was no longer a medieval backwater. It was an official European empire. A few decades later, another formidable leader stepped onto the throne, Catherine the Great. The funny thing about Catherine the Great is that she was not even Russian. She was a minor German princess named Sophie, who was brought to Russia to marry Tsar Peter III. Her husband was incompetent, immature, and obsessed with playing with toy soldiers. So, Catherine made a move. She won over the Imperial Guard, staged a military coup, locked her husband in a palace where he conveniently died a few days later, and declared herself Empress of Russia in 1762. Catherine ruled for 34 years, and she was one of the smartest, most ruthless politicians in European history. She read Western philosophers, built schools and museums, smallpox vaccinated herself to set an example for her people, expanded Russia's borders by millions of square miles, partitioned Poland out of existence, and annexed Crimea from the Ottoman Empire, securing Russia's access to the Black Sea. By 1800, Russia was an absolute titan, but its biggest test was about to march across the European continent. In June 1812, a European general, the Master of Europe, gathered the largest army the continent had ever seen, the Grande Armée. 600,000 soldiers from across Europe marched into Russia, confident they would conquer Moscow in a matter of weeks. The Russian army knew they could not defeat the invading general in a direct, open battle. So they used Russia's ultimate weapon, space and time. The Russian forces slowly retreated deeper and deeper into their vast interior, burning every crop field, destroying every bridge, and poisoning every well behind them. This was the scorched earth strategy. The European general kept chasing them, marching hundreds of miles into the endless, empty Russian landscape. His supply lines got stretched to the breaking point. His horses died of starvation, and his soldiers grew exhausted. Finally, in September 1812, the two armies clashed at the bloody Battle of Borodino outside Moscow. 70,000 men died in a single day. The Russians retreated once more, leaving Moscow wide open. The general proudly marched into Moscow, expecting the Tsar to send a letter begging for peace. Instead, Russian agents set fire to their own capital city. The general stood in the Kremlin and watched Moscow burn to the ground around him. There was no food, no shelter, and no Tsar begging for peace. After waiting 5 agonizing weeks in the ashes, the general realized he had been trapped. In October, he ordered a retreat, and then General Winter arrived. Temperatures plummeted to 30 below zero. Starving, freezing, and constantly ambushed by Russian Cossacks riding out of the woods, the general's army dissolved into a nightmare of frostbite and cannibalism. Out of the 600,000 men Napoleon brought into Russia, fewer than 30,000 made it out alive. Russian troops chased the remnants of the invading general's army all the way back to Paris, riding their horses down the Champs-Élysées. Russia had saved Europe from Napoleon, but internally, the empire was sitting on a ticking time bomb. Because while Western Europe was building factories, railways, and democracies, Russia was still relying on serfdom. Over 80% of the Russian population were serfs, literal human slaves who were bought, sold, and traded along with the land they worked on. They had zero rights, zero education, and zero hope. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II finally signed a decree liberating millions of serfs. But the freedom was a mess. The peasants were given terrible land and forced to pay massive government mortgages for decades. The peasants were angry, the nobles were angry, and radical revolutionary groups began popping up all over the country. In 1881, a radical group threw a bomb at a Tsar's carriage in St. Petersburg, killing the very Tsar who had freed the serfs. His successors, Alexander III and Nicholas II, cracked down hard. They unleashed secret police, built censorship networks, and refused to grant political reforms. They tried to freeze time, but time was running out. In 1914, World War I exploded across Europe. Tsar Nicholas II, a well-meaning but hopelessly weak and incompetent man, led Russia into the war. It was an absolute disaster. Millions of poorly equipped Russian soldiers were slaughtered on the Eastern Front. Some soldiers were sent into battle without rifles, told to wait until a comrade died and pick up his gun from the mud. Back home in the cities, food ran out, factory workers went on strike, and people stood in freezing bread lines for hours. To make matters worse, while Tsar Nicholas was away at the front, his wife, Empress Alexandra, was running the government in Petrograd under the hypnotic influence of a bizarre, unwashed Siberian monk. Rasputin claimed he could cure the Tsar's hemophiliac son, Alexei. He appointed ministers, dismissed generals, and caused massive scandals until a group of desperate noblemen murdered the monk in 1916, poisoning him, shooting him 3 times, and throwing his body into an ice-cold river. By February 1917, the Russian public had reached its breaking point. Huge riots broke out in Petrograd. Soldiers sent to shoot the protesters mutinied, turned their weapons on their own officers, and joined the crowd. Tsar Nicholas II realized he had lost total control. On March 2, 1917, inside a train carriage, the Tsar signed a paper abdicating the throne. 300 years of Romanov rule vanished in a single afternoon. A temporary democratic provisional government took over, but they made one fatal mistake. They decided to stay in World War I. Waiting in the wings was a ruthless, bald revolutionary who had spent years hiding in exile in Europe. Vladimir Lenin. The German government, eager to knock Russia out of the war, put the revolutionary leader on a sealed train, handed him millions of dollars in secret funding, and shipped him back into Russia like a biological weapon. Lenin offered the desperate population 3 simple words: peace, land, bread. In October 1917, the revolutionary leader's radical communist party, the Bolsheviks, stormed the Winter Palace, overthrew the provisional government, and seized power in a swift coup. The Bolsheviks immediately pulled Russia out of World War I, confiscated all private property, banned religion, and executed the Tsar and his entire family in a basement in Ekaterinburg. A brutal 3-year civil war erupted between the Red Army and the anti-communist White Army. Over 7 million people died of war and famine before the Red Army emerged victorious. In 1922, the revolutionary leader officially declared the creation of a brand new state, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The USSR Lenin died 2 years later in 1924, and taking his place was a former bank robber from Georgia who took the underground name Stalin, meaning man of steel. Joseph Stalin would become one of the most prolific mass murderers in human history. Stalin wanted to turn the rural USSR into an industrial superpower overnight. He forcibly took all farmland away from peasants, creating massive state-run collective farms. When Ukrainian peasants resisted, a leader intentionally engineered a devastating famine in 1932, known as the Holodomor. Millions of people starved to death while the Soviet state confiscated every grain of wheat and exported it overseas to buy factory machinery. Then came the Great Purge of the late 1930s. The leader became pathologically paranoid that his own party and army were plotting against him. He set up execution quotas for every region. His secret police, the NKVD, dragged hundreds of thousands of party members, military generals, scientists, and ordinary citizens out of their beds in the middle of the night. Over 700,000 people were shot in the back of the head, and millions more were sent to forced labor camps in the freezing wilderness of Siberia, the Gulag network. Stalin executed almost his entire top military leadership, and that paranoia almost cost Russia its existence.